I'll say official welcome now that we're recording. So, welcome to this evening's discussion of parenting for a better world with some of its contributors. I'm going to hand over now to Susie, who's one of the editors, and has, I guess this is one of your labor of love, along with Ellen. And I would love you to just kind of introduce this section of the time.
Thanks, Danielle, and thanks for hosting us this evening. I think all of us here and the other contributors are really excited about the book, and we hope that people are as excited about it and find it as helpful as we have writing it. What we want to do in this first section is just introduce the book ourselves and the book a little bit. So Ellen, do you want to start off by just saying something about how the book came to be?
Yeah, sure. Well, first, thanks again, Danielle. This is a real treat. And it's fun it's great to be here. I'm grateful for the chance to tell more people about the book, but also it's great to be here with Leah and with Luke. You work on a book project with someone for a year and a half and you don't always get to see them. So this is actually a real treat in a lot of different ways. So Susie, so I teach at Candler School of Theology, which is attached to Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, in the States. And I think the backstory needs to begin with me saying that Susie and I have known each other for about 13 years when she was a postdoctoral fellow at Candler. And we've stayed in touch, as you do when you have common interests. But like many people, we sort of got reconnected during the lockdown of COVID. And we were trying to juggle the 24/7 caregiving and also keep some work moving forward and some writing projects moving forward. And so we formed a little writing group called Mom's Writing. And that gave us some company and some accountability. And in the context of that sort of writing work, something became acute for us, which is a perennial reality, which is how do you juggle the intense caregiving and the work that you're called to do in your professional life and in your social and community and church life? How do you sort of juggle all of that? And so that confluence of things, a little writing group and this perennial question that we were talking about, it was sort of natural that we started thinking about, well, if we might pull together a book of people who could, in our estimation, do this juggle, not just the juggling, but the kind of integration of parenting and justice work. Well, what might that look like? And we're just so lucky that everybody we reached out to said yes. And so we wound up with this, I think, really lovely and hopefully, but certainly honest and hopefully encouraging book of writing, reflection, sharing of experiences, offering some insights for how to integrate parenting and justice work without making a promise that you can do it all. It's sort of doing the best we can every day. And so I think, Susie, I'll pass it back to you to give a little more content description.
Thanks, Ellen. So the book's got 13 chapters written by 13 different contributors, and we're all based in the UK, the US, or Canada. And we felt that our context, while really different, had some of the same threads and issues, whether that's the state of the church and the struggles the church is facing, or the state of society and our politics and growth in particular, kind of far-right politics and so on. So we're grappling with some of the same issues in our context, which made sense to draw us together and has actually generated a really rich conversation across contexts, I think. So each of the chapters is written by a different author and it explores a different practice. We decided not to focus on a particular issue or injustice in each chapter. So we decided not to structure the book by one chapter looking at racism and one chapter looking at sexism and one chapter looking at ageism, for example. We decided to structure it by practice. So what kinds of things and ways can we engage practically in caregiving while also engaging in trying to make the world a better place? So we've got chapters on prayer and on listening, on edible gardening, on making music, on street protest, on giving out backpacks, on collage, on cultivating kindness, on waiting, imagining, and on practicing solidarity. And of course, each of these chapters tends to focus on one particular issue or a couple of issues, but the focus is really on the practice. And how do we do that? Well, we explore the practice by weaving together different threads. So all of us talk about our own experience of the practice, how we've gone about it, where it's worked, where it's spectacularly failed, and anything between those two ends of the spectrum. So we talk quite personally. We offer some theological exploration of the practice. So where do we find this living, or where do we find its roots in the Christian tradition? And perhaps most concretely, each chapter ends with a try it out section. And in that are step-by-step instructions or kind of hints or tips as to how readers might go about giving the practice a go themselves. They all look a bit different, the try it out sections. And they're not designed to be blueprints for action as if somehow we've got it all right and you just follow this plan and then you'll be fine, and it'll all work. But they're just some of our own ideas and suggestions that have come through our own experience of this practice. So that's how the book's structured. It's quite straightforward. And I think what I want to do now is really invite the other contributors who are here and have joined us this evening to say something, give a little bit more texture about what led them to write their particular chapter, the motivation behind it, but also say something about what you say in your chapter and what's it all about. Leah, do you want to kick us off with some thoughts on your chapter?
Sure. Thank you so much, Susie and Ellen and Danielle, for organizing this. Hello, everyone. My name is Leah Gunning-Francis, and I was very pleased to write the chapter on street protesting and self-esteem. And this comes out of my experience being the mother of two African-American sons. They're currently ages 14 and 15. And while they were only 6 and 7 years old, our family, my husband Rodney, the four of us were living in St. Louis, Missouri during the time of the unfortunate killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri by a Ferguson police officer. And so my husband was serving a congregation at the time. I was on faculty at a school, and we were very involved with what was happening in faith communities related to matters of justice, and were out in a lot of the protests. At that time, the boys were a little too young at that point, only because in those early days, there were so many unknowns. We didn't quite know what was happening and wanted to just sort of test things out and see what was going on. But living through the Ferguson movement and being involved in that in such an intricate way as we was really reminded us of a couple things. Number one, yesterday is still today in terms of what it means for everyday people such as ourselves to stand up and speak out relating matters of justice. And two, particularly for African Americans in the United States. And we see this happening in so many different kinds of ways, where issues of racial injustice that are continuing to show up in our society on so many different levels. And so my husband and I were pretty certain that, we wanted to try to find constructive ways to engage our sons in doing this work where they were able to, one, still have their being affirmed. We all mostly know that when the Constitution of the United States was drafted, Black people were deemed 3/5 of a human being. And iterations of that have happened throughout this country's history. And so we have to be very explicit and overt when it comes to seeking to help affirm the identity of Black people in this country, and particularly for our young sons. And so that's the one piece of it, of looking to build their self-esteem, to affirm their humanity and who they are as, number one, people that are created in the image of God, people that are loved by God, loved by us, loved by a community of people, and for whom we trust will find their way in the world and flourish. And second, to also sort of cultivate this sense of, yes, not only do I matter as a person, but my voice also matters. And how is it that we work to create ways, pathways, where they can make their voices heard, their opinions, their perspectives. And while there are myriad ways we do that, one in particular, as it relates to this chapter, is through the work of street protesting and being able to get engaged in matters that are of salient importance to them. And so we were able to do that here in Indianapolis a few years ago, very shortly after the tragic killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. We saw, unfortunately, with our own eyes, this man who was handcuffed, Black man, handcuffed, a police officer kneeling on his neck until he died. Protests erupted all over the country, to include Indianapolis. I was very involved in organizing, along with Faith in Indiana, the protest in Indianapolis, and we had over 1,000 people. And both the boys were involved in that. You know, our youngest son played the djembe drum that helped lead the procession for the march. And our oldest son was there and was engaged with, just walking and participating, as well as my husband. And not only did we walk in the march and participate and we helped lead, but also had family time for reflecting on what we did and why we did it and how we understood that to be an expression of our faith, an expression of who we are and those beliefs that we hold so dearly. So I talk about this in the book. I talk about why it's important to build our children's self-esteem, how helping them see themselves as agents and not just thinking that they can't be involved in matters of justice until they're adults. So often we ask children, what do you want to be when you grow up? And that's an all right question, but I think perhaps some other questions we want to ask our children are, what's on your mind today? Are there things that you see that you wish were different today? Is there anything that's troubling you today? We have to affirm the full humanity of our children today, whatever age they are, in very appropriate ways that are good for them, for helping to build their self-confidence and self-esteem.
Thank you so much, Leah, and it's such a beautiful and a powerful chapter. So thank you. Luke, can we turn to you now? Do you want to say something about your chapter and where it came from in you?
Yeah, sure. I suppose there were probably two main motivations behind what I wrote. One of them comes from, I guess, a bit of a pet peeve I have with a lot of the writing that comes out of my own tradition, which is shared with some of you, certainly Susie, in the Church of England, which is that a lot of writing about mission and church and social justice seems to be written from the assumption that the practitioner is a person with power and privilege. So we have a lot of this stuff, about like being with and stuff like that. And I wanted to write something that explored the idea, what is it like when your presence in the room is interruptive for some reason? And we have a very strong social class system still in the UK. I come from a working class background. I was a bricklayer before going into ministry. So that was part of it, was wanting to mess around with this idea of what does it look like when the practitioner is not a person of privilege. And then building on that, I wanted to think about, we're a family with, to some extent, some complex needs. There's issues around mental health in our family. My little boy seems to be very much taking after me and being quite hyperactive and struggling with his attention sometimes and stuff like that. So for both of us, listening is not something that necessarily comes easily to us. But yeah, I'd seen the power of listening, particularly in my wife's work with a charity supporting sex workers. The distinctive thing that made her so good at her job was her ability to listen and empathize with people in a way which kind of interrupted the flow of giving and doing too that charity had. So that was kind of what I was wanting to play with. So that's where I came up with this idea of interruptive listening, which was very much drawing from a book called Being Interrupted by a couple of friends of mine, Al and Ruth, but wanting to kind of maybe play with some of the stuff around that a little bit differently. I want to read just a really brief little bit where I talk about what I mean by interruptive listening. Interruptive listening means pausing one's own agenda and desire to speak in order to fully attend to the other person. Henry Nouwen regards this as one of the most powerful acts of hospitality and love that we can show to one another. In justice work, I've repeatedly seen well-intentioned people allow their help to turn into hurt because they couldn't see past their own agenda. They couldn't let their plans be interrupted enough to see and hear the people they were trying to support. This, of course, relates to parenting too. I try and often fail to make my son feel heard and valued, especially when he's distressed. I also try to ask him good questions. I want him to learn that listening is an act of love. I was thinking a lot about this phrase. I don't know if you have this phrase in the States, but in the UK, we have this old saying, which is that children should be seen and not heard. And my dad always used to say children should be seen and not heard, and preferably not seen either. But I was thinking about that and about how children are often people that aren't listened to at all. In fact, some of my kids' storybooks, one of them is a story about a kid that gets eaten by a monster because he asks too many questions, you know. And I was thinking, like, what kind of message does that send, you know? But I was thinking about how valuable it's been for me to talk through some of what's happening with my son when I'm involved in some kind of justice work. So one particular example of that, last year, the British Home Office were planning to build on the side of an immigration detention centre, which is essentially like a prison where refugees are kept before being deported. And they were planning to house 200 legal asylum seekers on this kind of compound up against the prison fence. And so I was part of an interfaith group that resisted those plans and did an action involving getting all the faith leaders in our area to write openly to the Home Office, and did a bit of cheeky organising in the background because some representatives of the council were in our church choir and stuff like that. But one day I was talking maybe to a radio person or someone on the phone when I should have been watching cartoons with my kid. And he was asking me after I put the phone down about what I was talking about. So I kind of tried to explain in ways that a 6-year-old would understand what was happening. And the rage that he expressed at the idea of people being forced against their will to live in this awful site, you know, just the uncontrolled rage he had, and, you know, he just couldn't understand it. And he was saying, you know, how, you know, like a kid would, like, how would these people like it if they were taken away from their families? And, you know, in moments like that, I just realized, even at the age of, I guess he was 5 at the time, he was so able to clearly articulate what was wrong in that situation. And we often miss, you know, that sense of injustice that children have. And I've seen this time and time again with him. You know, he's got a real sensitivity. I kind of grounded the chapter theologically in the idea of kenosis, which or self-emptying. It's often described that from Philippians chapter 2. But there's an Anglican theologian, Sarah Coakley, who talks about what if we look at kenosis not so much as a self-emptying, but as a non-grasping, of refusing to grasp certain ways of holding power or certain forms of power. And I thought, as parents, what does it look like? I was brought up in quite a heavy-handed disciplinary household in some ways, which probably explains why I turned out the way I did. But I was thinking, in our justice work and in our parenting, what does it look like to maybe not hold power in certain ways, but, you know, not ignoring power or pretending we don't have it, but choosing to be careful about the way we hold it. And then that's kind of led into this idea of listening. My doctoral research is on pneumatology, study of the Holy Spirit, and thinking about how do we discern where God is at work. And for me, that is so often my listening to God is listening to what's going on around me, the people I meet in the street, when I'm shuffling about in the parish in my cassock, and, you know, people come up and talk to me, and all of that, all kinds of fruity people come and say hi. So yeah, that was what was behind what I wrote. Just this collision of bizarre experiences as a president and a priest and a parent and all the rest of it.
Thank you so much, Luke. And I know that it's a really rich chapter, so many layers to kind of explore within it. So thank you. Ellen, you and I have spoken a little bit already, but do you want to say something fairly briefly about the content of your chapter as well?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to. So I have 3 kids. My oldest is now 18. She's officially an adult in the States and heading to college in the fall. And then we have twins that are 14, boy-girl twins. And our all 3 of them, but really Catherine, our oldest, grew up, sort of came of age in the Trump years. So she was 13 when he was elected. So the correspondence of all of the sort of horrible things at all levels of our society, language, policy implementation, policy, practices, all of these things corresponded with her developmentally getting really engaged in watching the news and political awareness and paying attention. And so part of what informs my chapter is not only how do parents who are privileged in various ways, for me it's race, class, traditional family, the ways that we're privileged, how do we help our kids engage effectively and resist these sort of forces in society constructively? And then also, how do we, in their adolescent years, help them develop healthily on emotional terms, right? So that, I mean, emotions, dealing with emotions is, I think, part of parenting at every age, and it is full on in the adolescent years. So you're really attentive to emotional development in these same years. So we had Trump, we had the emotional development of adolescence, and we had a kind of heightened engagement. We ended up co-authoring our chapter, so Catherine wrote with me, and what we focused on was really this question of how do white and otherwise privileged people engage in the work of social activism without centering our emotions. That was kind of the question, and it's such a, I think, a really dangerous and problematic habit that white people have, particularly in the work of racial justice, to keep talking about how we're feeling. And of course, it's not about the feelings of white people. So, but if you're trying as a family to do social justice work and develop our in kind of healthy ways as emotional people, clearly families need to pay attention to emotions that are alive and kind of ignited in the work of social justice. So that was sort of the focus of our chapter. I'll just say, if I can say sort of quickly, a way in which this continues to be, I think, so important. In the States right now, there are legislative maneuvers, most pronounced in Florida. There is a legislation that was just signed called the Stop Woke legislation. And the impetus here is to control what our public school systems can teach about race. And obviously white supremacy is behind this, but one of the articulated motivations is that critical race theory and other education about the role that white people have played in our racist history makes white kids feel bad. And that's a problem. And so they want to control that. So obviously that's not the answer to, that's not education, that's not the answer to history, but it is sort of raises, again, I think, the way in which working constructively with emotions and being honest with our history are both sort of family tasks, right? That sort of centering the feelings of white people that's just not the answer here. This is undermining all kinds of things. So anyway, that legislation has gotten me all fired up. So the practice that we've been trying to work on, or that we suggest in this chapter, is an exercise of meditation, a form of engaged meditation. So not a meditation that pulls you out of the world, but a practice of meditation that helps you to engage the world constructively. And what we're practicing is a form of meditation with collage. So collage is something that families do. It's a standard arts and crafts activity. I think it's easy to do, and it's a form of art that helps us capture all kinds of contradictions and ambiguities without trying to resolve them. So one of the things that Catherine and I do in our sort of morning meditation is she tends to do meditation with art, and I tend to meditate on art. And so we realized that this collage was sort of functioning in both ways for us. So we can do a form of meditation with collage that's giving us space to articulate something like utter outrage and an awareness of complicity, right? Or sadness and fury, or discouragement and delight. I mean, you can have a whole combination of things that you're expressing through this really powerful art form. And it's something that we can do with our kids sort of at all ages. So that's been a kind of outlet and a mechanism to sort of express emotions. And then it's given us a place to talk about and work constructively with these contradictory emotions in a meditative space, so that when we move into social spaces of public engagement, we've done some processing of the emotions at home, and we don't, keep sort of making the mistake of centering them in public, and we can keep the focus on people and policies and practices where the focus should remain.
Thanks so
Susie,
much,
how about you?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really interested to hear from other people. So I'm just going to say a very little bit about my chapter, which I guess emerged from the same place as the whole book idea, which was from a place of complete overwhelm at the enormity of the tasks of social justice, and in the case of my chapter, ecological climate crisis, and feeling completely overwhelmed at just how big it is and how small I am and how much I care about it all, not least because I have 7 and 4-year-old children, and I am afraid for them and for their generation and for their children of what the planet is going to be like and whether there's even going to be a planet. So I think my approach initially had been a real sort of scattergun. I've got to do something, I'll do anything. I went off on street protests, which are really important, and I'd do a bit of this, and then I'd join this, and I'd sign a petition online, but something just wasn't grounding it all for me. It just felt like I was acting for my own sake, to make myself feel better in a way, rather than really thinking through or rooting myself in a practice that came and was from who I am and from the context of my life. And in the ways that these things often do, a few threads started to come together. I won't tell you them all here, but one of them was that I read in an extraordinary book about gardening and horticulture and mental health, about a project called Incredible Edible Todmorden, which is in Yorkshire in the north of England, that began in 2008. And a group of people, in fact just a few people to start with, started repurposing disused ground in their community. It was a community that had really fallen on quite hard times because the industries that had kept the town buoyant had declined. So, it was a town that had all sorts of reasons why it was struggling. And essentially, this project brought these disused pieces of ground back to life through planting edibles that people were then encouraged to go and pick. So they'd plant tomato plants in a disused parking lot, and people could go and help themselves to the produce. And it's an extraordinary project to read about in and of itself. So the long and short of it is, in the chapter, I reflect theologically on the practice of gardening, on the creativity that's involved, and in gardening as a justice making, or that has the potential to be a justice making practice. I also find it a contemplative practice. I engage in growing vegetables myself. And there's something about vegetable growing that kind of puts human beings in their place. It never works. We've been having a battle of, my house against the slugs, and I can tell you this year, the slugs have won every day. And there's something really important about that. But it hasn't just been about me and my lettuce or me and my slugs or whatever. We've also got an edible growing project going in the local community. This doesn't solve climate change. I'm not suggesting it does for a second, But for me, it's been a really important communal space in which I found some grounding for what is this huge issue, which needs to sit alongside other actions. But it's one I can do with my kids, at least on a good day. Sometimes they're interested in pulling up carrots, let's be real, sometimes they're really not. But it is something in which they can get involved. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there on my chapter and hand back to Danielle, because it would be great to hear from other people.
Great, thank you all so much. So we thought we'd open it up here for a few minutes anyway, to just, if anyone feels like they'd like to share, like what drew you to join this discussion today? Was there something in particular? And if you've read this book, was there something in particular that struck you from any of the chapters, or that you'd like to comment on? So first, what drew you to join today?
I can jump in.
Yeah, jump in.
Yeah, I've read the book, so I wanted to hear more from you all. It's you know, I loved how personal it was. I feel like I got glimpses into your family life, so I wanted to come and hear a little bit more. I have two boys who are 9 and 12, so I'm right in the throes of parenting and schooling and everything during COVID. I was at towards the end of my first year of the MDiv program when this all happened. So I definitely relate to the chaos of sorting it through. But I think one of the things that I really loved about the book was that it was a little bit sneaky with some of the deeper things that it requires you to look at about yourself and the way you parent. You know, I mean, you guys hit on it right at the introduction when you're talking about sometimes we get caught up in the to-do. And so I picked up the book and I'm like, oh, this is practices. These are things I can do. And, right into it, we start getting into the things where we really have to look at ourselves. And Luke, I really loved your chapter and how you addressed power, because that's something that has definitely been a generational change for me in how I approach parenting. And so I think that was so important to put out there as we look at this. So this is not just about a one-way, like imparting justice into our children and teaching them. It's about a dialogue with them. And it's really a participative process for all of us. So just thank you all for being here and sharing.
That resonates with me too. Like, COVID was just tough, wasn't it? And some of these experiences of parenting, I think particularly with what Luke was saying about the interruptive listening, I realized it really kind of made me uncomfortable, because how poor I am at times at listening to particularly my younger one. And how often that particularly in COVID times, I kind of escaped into doing my work on my computer because I couldn't cope with the chaos in the house of the things all around me. And I'm still kind of processing some of that. And this conversation's coming at quite an interesting time in my life, in that I'm stepping out of this role with Red Letter Christians. It's been one of my part-time roles, and I'm stepping more fully into my roles at church. I'm a church leader, and into mothering. And I've realized how, like, I had a bit of a crash with my own mental health, kind of post-COVID, and I've realized in recent months how important it is for me to not just make time for my kids, but to make time to have the brain space for my kids. And how many things I thought I was doing to serve my community and the world were actually maybe escapism, and in some ways, and at the cost of some things for my family. And sometimes you don't realize that when you're in the kind of throes of it. And also, like, that really helpful challenge of, even wanting to engage in justice work, but your kids are all these individual personalities, and sometimes you have to make choices to lay certain battles down for a time, because it's not what your family can manage, and what you do with the emotions of that. So I appreciate the conversation. It's very timely for me. Anyone have anything else they'd like to share? You can also type in the chat if you'd prefer to do that. can also answer the question, what are you hoping to get out of this time together? Well, we can kind of keep we can continue to share some feedback as we just kind of move on to this next session. I don't want to put too many pressure on the folks on this that are here today. Can I hand back over to you, Susie?
Sure. And what I'd say is, if anybody wants to interrupt us and ask questions as we're going along, do just unmute or raise your hand or indicate or whatever, and do come in. We can keep this as much more of a free-flowing thing rather than kind of us just talking and then having space for response, because there's so few of us. So do please come in if you've got questions or you've got something to add. Yeah, we thought we'd just, I suppose, take a little bit of time to highlight, I guess, some of the threads that weave throughout the book, or to put it differently, what are some of the key points or the key themes that kind of we've discerned together, I think. And as always, we try to point to some of these in the introduction, but the introduction could only be written after we'd read all of the chapters. And indeed we did set ourselves up in groups as authors in the process of writing the book, so that we were having conversation with one another as we went along. And I think kind of, I guess, riffing off what you were saying, Danielle, one of the themes, or one of the important things for us in this book, is to be real. And I think, you were mentioning that too, Amy, in a sense, is really hard. It's really hard work trying to parent in and of itself, even if you did nothing else, right? Parenting is a really tough gig. Never mind also trying to engage in the world for justice and being members of churches and having jobs or other employment. And some of what we try to do in the book is not just to go, well, this is how you do it and this is going to be great, but is to talk about what hasn't worked and where our regrets are, as well as what's been joyful, because it's not all doom and gloom as well. There can be real joy and delight in some of this work. So I just wondered whether any of the contributors, or indeed anybody else on the call, wanted to share anything about, regrets and failures, but also joys in this complex work of weaving everything together in our lives.
So often people will ask about a work-family life balance. And I've come to the conclusion in my experience that such a thing just doesn't exist. That if we're, let me speak for myself, ever thinking that, you can give equal amounts of time and energy, brain space, bandwidth to all of these responsibilities in the same way at the same time, that's just not been something that's been realistic for me. And so, number one, I don't even talk about any type of trying to strive for a balance, but rather the way I try to think and talk about it is through the lens of how do I keep fidelity to the tasks at hand in a way that are going to be hopefully meaningful and productive, but also attending to my own well-being, physically, spiritually, emotionally. And, that hasn't always worked well. It hasn't always, I've come to this place through a lot of trial and error and through a lot of, this, maybe that's not working, but to try and see myself as a parent, as a mother who is giving 100 to the work of parenting, which, just like, as you all have already said, like that act alone is worthy of its own 12-hour webinar on what that means for us. But the integration of, creating kind of these, cultivating space for social consciousness and engagement, I feel like the joy in that comes when, not only when I see them engaging in different types of activities or even talking about a particular issue that maybe has them riled up, but rather the joy for me has come in seeing them share some things totally outside of that context. So for example, let me just give an example of that. This summer, our oldest son, he's 15, and he was in a poetry writing class this summer with 2 local poets in Indianapolis that are fantastic through the Indiana Humanities Program. He had to apply, got accepted, and did great. This dude wrote his own poems, original poems that were out of this world. And one of the poems was deeply grounded in his experience of home and what that meant for him. And the other poem was deeply grounded in his sense of identity, which I could hear threads of many of the kind of justice-related conversations, work that we've had come out of that. And I'm just going, holy cats, this is where the real joy comes, right? Where you see that kind of integration, where you see children on their own without you even asking questions at the moment for how they're synthesizing and integrating these kinds of awarenesses into their lives, into their being, and into their own work. So that for me is where the joy has come. I think the trial and error of the challenges is something that, you know, I'm still living through and figuring out, and trying to give myself some grace. Let me just put that out there for the parents. We've got to give ourselves grace. I mean, seriously, like, give us this day our daily grace. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. So much wisdom in that. And I really resonate with the joy when you hear your kids, something clicking and something connecting. We have a totally different practice at home than the one I wrote about, where we share one meal at a weekend. And my kids are only 4 and 7 still, so pretty young, where we share something that we're grateful for and something that, you know, we want to pray for, hold in mind. You know, and at the beginning, they talked about things that were very particular to them as 4-year-old and 7-year-old, you know, about a new Lego set or whatever it was. And now they're really, really thoughtful about who they talk about and identify as people to hold in mind. And it's really particular, you know, they'll talk about people who don't have homes when it's cold, and you can tell that they've really thought through that connection. And that is also a source of joy for me. So I really resonated kind of with what you said there. Anybody else want to come in on that one, the joys or the failures? Luke?
I think probably the biggest challenge over the last couple of years anyway, so I was ordained in 2020, just as we were coming out of lockdown. It was delayed and we moved to a new town for me to start my post here, so new church, new environment, and everything. The biggest challenge really has, I think, for me, been church, in the sense of, in a family context. We were part of a church before, which I found remarkably frustrating, but they were really good with kids, and Jared used to really enjoy going and taking part in the kids' activities and things. But we've come to a place that really isn't good with kids, and what that's meant is that my wife and son haven't really engaged in church for the last 2 years. And alongside that, all of the experiences, some of which I talk about in the chapter, of just sitting with people experiencing some quite extreme forms of marginalization. I've been so lucky to have studying theology in all these places to reflect on all of that, and you know, picking up spiritual practices that have helped me engage with that stuff. I read a book a few years ago, it's probably my favorite book actually, by a theologian called Reverend Dr. Monica Coleman, called Making a Way Out of No Way, where she really grapples with this intense experience of pain in a pastoral context and how that shaped her theology, and that just resonated so much with me. But what I've kind of seen with my family is them kind of come to, you know, not have so much interest in particularly in church, not so much in faith, but in church particularly. So that's been a big challenge, and it's thinking about, you know, how do we make room for families and children who are used to interacting with adults in school and learning in a very different way now, in a church institution that thinks if we could just do everything like we did it in the 50s, everything would be fine. So that's been really hard. And yet at the same time, seeing my 6-year-old engage with some of these huge theological questions about omnipotence and stuff like that, you know, and because he hasn't been enculturated into an environment where some questions aren't okay to ask, he just asks these great questions. And he also, because his school is extremely diverse and is very religiously diverse as well. So we had an interesting conversation on the way to school the other day where he said that his friend in his class believes in a God that looks like an elephant with lots of arms. And he was like, that sounds kind of stupid to me, Daddy. And I was like, okay, well, let's have some conversations about that. And I was like, maybe that sounds stupid to you because it's not what you're used to. And, you know, maybe the fact that we say we eat God on Sunday morning might sound kind of stupid to him, you know. And so I feel like there's great joy in the midst of it, but the pain is in thinking as a church leader, is my primary job is to be a priest. How do I curate space for this for other families who I'm sure are going through the same stuff? And that's just something I don't feel like I'm anywhere near to beginning to address yet.
Thanks, Luke. That's great, really helpful, I think, and probably a struggle that many of us can relate to in different ways in different contexts. Anybody else, any thoughts on that? I wondered whether we might want to talk about one of the other themes of the book, I think, which comes through again and again, and relates, I think, to what we've been saying about just how hard this is, I think, almost all of the chapters, and in different ways, talk about how the work for justice takes place in small, everyday ways. Yes, the grand moments, the big moments that are captured on the front of the headlines on the news are important. Those are absolutely important. And yet each chapter also talks about how actually the hard labor for justice also takes place at the kitchen table. It takes place in the everyday conversations, that those are kind of the building blocks from which then these big moments can spring and can emerge. And I think I found that deeply reassuring, that what we do in the everyday, that planting a carrot mindfully and thoughtfully, encouraging my kids, engaging people in the community, thinking about sustainable growing in really tiny ways, in ways that can be woven into my daily routine, that isn't an extra job, mattered. That yes, it's never going to be enough, but it was something, and it was significant, and it had to go back to your word, Leah, there was grace in it, there was fidelity in it. And I wondered if anybody, either people who've contributed to the book or others, wanted to talk about that space of the everyday, the kind of seemingly insignificant and the small, in their work towards justice and for justice in the world.
I'd like to make mention of how that has shown up a bit for us over the years, especially as the boys have gotten older, going from, clearly in that childhood stage into adolescence, because what happens so often with Black boys in particular, and Black girls too, in different kinds of ways, but once they move from the cute little 5-year-old stage, or they're seen as children, to the 10, 11, 12-year-old stage where it's been documented that they're perceived to be older than they are as adults. So not, as young adults more than children. It plays itself out, and that kind of awareness on my part happened in the everydayness. And so let me just give a quick example of that. One day, a few years ago, we were in our neighborhood. We live in a predominantly white neighborhood in Indianapolis, and we were walking home from a neighbor's house who lived around the corner. And we're walking, and my youngest son was about 10 at the time. And he said, "Mommy, I'm going to run home the rest of the way." And I immediately stopped in my tracks. And I said, "Desmond, don't run." And he said, "Well, why, Mommy?" I said, "Well, Desmond, it's getting dark now." It was around dusk, and it was starting to get dark. And I said, it was one of those moments where I'm going, oh God, here we go. We're just having a regular moment walking home from a neighbor, and I have to unfortunately have a life talk with my son in the street, and just had to reiterate how sometimes there might be people, because of the color of his skin, who think in this neighborhood, who think that, you know, if he's running and it's near dark, that he's up to no good or going to steal something. And he said to me, he said, but mommy, and he's pointing to some of our neighbors, he said, but they know me, they wouldn't do that. I said, no, I know they wouldn't do that. And he points to another house and said, but they know me too. I said, I know, son, they would never do anything to hurt you. I said, but all it takes is for somebody who's riding through the neighborhood and doesn't know who you are and doesn't know who we are, that might look at you and make that false assumption where the racialized imagination kicks in. And too often, that has ended adversely for so many Black people. And so the everydayness for us, and sort of coming to the realization of what it means to not only engage acts of justice in the world, but how deeply and intricately these acts are tied to our being, has been the greatest source of pain and rage that I have as a parent, as a mother. And so it is out of that comes so much of what I do and why I do it and how I do it. And while at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, just trying to raise people who can still feel good about themselves and be clear that, no, this is their house. This is their street. Your parents pay a boatload of taxes to live on it. And you know that you belong here. The problem is not you. The problem is other people that have created a problem for you. Is just an ongoing work that happens in the everydayness of our lives. Let me be very clear. Thankfully, that these aren't the conversations we have to have every single day of our lives, thank God. I actually have to hop off because of another commitment we have with him that's really a joyful and great one. But this is still a really difficult reality that we live with, and so many people around the globe live with, that you know, that our work, that our struggle for justice, that it is deeply tied to who we are, comes up in these everyday moments, lived out in the everydayness of our lives, and calls us to keep fidelity to it. I just come back to that word of fidelity, while yet still remembering to say, give us this day our daily grace. It's so good to be with you. Thank you all so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, Leah.
Thank you.
Take care. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
And I think some really important reminders there about how the pain and the injustice are in the daily life, as well as the kind of work towards justice. And sort of building on that, I think some really important comments in the chat around just how hard it can be, depending on the circumstances of your family, and whether everybody in your family is on the same page with priorities and this kind of work, how much time you even to have at home or can make to have these kinds of conversations. You know, sometimes we are just rushing from one thing to another, or it's not possible, or it doesn't feel right, or there are priorities in our family that actually need to take all of the needs of our children in different ways, physically, mentally, need to take all of our time for a season of life. And I think it's really important. Thank you for raising those, because I think we're recognizing that in the book, and want to say, yeah, this is what it really is. There's no, you know, there aren't any blueprints. We're not offering this is how to do it and you can successfully do it this way, because everybody's on their own journey to try and work out what's I'm not even going to say right for them, but good enough for them and important in this time and this place. Because I don't think, at least, you know, and I'm speaking for myself here, I don't think there's no obvious route often. It's about how can we well enough cobble together meaningful commitments and actions in our lives in different ways. Anybody else want to speak to that kind of the small and the everyday being a space of injustice and justice? Luke?
I mean, I think I just resonate so much with what Danielle was saying earlier about how you know, diving into the justice work with both feet can be an escape from the realities of home sometimes, and that's a real temptation. And I've known so many kind of Christian activists or big name personalities whose kids end up just hating their guts because they're never around, you know. And so the kind of small and the mundane for me sometimes is incredibly hard to do, but it's just putting my phone away and playing Xbox with my kids, you know. It's letting him know that he matters to me, and that he's important, and trying to model some sort of healthy balance. I know we wrestle with the idea of balance, and I agree with Leah about that. There are weeks when it's easier to do that, and there are weeks when it's impossible. But I think that the small everyday things, often it's the saying no, you know, to show him it's possible to do some good in your little corner of the world without it destroying you. You know, the old quote by Nietzsche, I think it is beware in fighting the dragon lest you become a dragon. And I think it's very easy for that to happen sometimes.
Ellen.
Yeah, this has been such a helpful conversation, and I've been sitting here thinking about so we have 3 kids, as I've mentioned. They all have very different personalities, and their ways of communicating their concern and their engagement and their activism also vary tremendously. And I think one of the things that I've been learning about that is that I ought not expect our sort of quieter, more introverted son to engage the world in the same way that his very out there feisty sisters do. But that doesn't mean that he's also not being formed and teaching us about all of this work. You know, there's just a sense of like an activist kid looks a certain way. And so I think it's important I just keep learning that. So what's on my mind in particular is that we have at our house a flagpole out in front. And our deal with the flagpole was that when my husband wanted to put it in, that I said, well, we can put in the flagpole as long as we fly lots of different kinds of flags. So this is not a US flag, you know, stars and stripes flagpole. We're gonna fly all kinds of things. So we got one of those, you know, those things that you hang over your door and you put your shoes in it, has all those pockets. So we have several of those, and it's just full of different kinds of flags. So if we have a friend visiting from a state, we fly their state flag. If it's, you know, LGBTQ Pride Month, we fly the rainbow flag. So we have lots of flags. So I got, because of the Roe v. Wade issue in the States a couple of weeks ago, I got a flag that's a black flag, and it has a feminist symbol and a fist, and it's, you know, very bold feminist flag. So it came the other day, and I was saying to my son this morning, I got to put up this new flag. And so he went out there, and he took down the flag that's up, put up the feminist flag, and he kept kind of turning it around to make sure that the angle was right. And it was just the sweetest thing to kind of watch him do that. And when he came in, I just said, do you know what that flag is? And he was like, yeah, it's women's rights. And then he ran up to his room. And that was it. That was like all that we got. But I thought, you know, that's awesome. So I'm going to take that as a win. That's the way that my son's going to communicate his paying attention to the world. So anyway, that's, I think, my offering on celebrating the small things and remembering that our kids express their, just like in all areas of their life, they'll express their political interests in the range of ways and with their own sort of the tone of their own personality, and that's good.
That's such a lovely story, Ellen. For those who haven't read the book yet or who are interested, I mean, I think the range of ways in which the everyday can be a space for engagement is, I think there are some really great ideas in this book. So it's not all about table talk and having the hardcore conversations about the difficult stuff and getting your kids G'd up to go out on a protest or to even to fly a flag, Ellen. You know, we've got Ingrid Rasmussen's talking about how you can sing a lullaby at bedtime to your baby in a way that forms understanding of justice and forms family commitment to justice. You know, we've got Chinwe MacDonald writing about how just cultivating kindness in your toddler is super important. Being kind to your neighbours on your street, being kind to bugs that you nearly tread on the road, that this stuff's super important in terms of our formation. You know, there's always a danger I'm going to leave somebody out, but I think about Brian Brock talking about how patience, waiting on family members. You know, he talks about his experience with his son who has Down syndrome and is also on the autism spectrum, how actually waiting for one another, patience, is a practice of justice, and how we forget that these things that don't seem as if they're kind of, you know, got social justice in the headline are actually the basis and the foundation. So one of the things I love about the book is how diverse the kind of everyday ways can be, and that it's not always obvious, it's not always explicit, and often isn't explicit that this is work for justice, I think. So that's something I've really valued in learning from other people who've written in the book. Any other thoughts on the everyday? Or anybody else got some great ideas about what they do in their everyday lives, in the kind of, you know, warp and weft of crazy family home life, that might be construed as justice making? Yeah, Danielle.
I mean, I'm not sure I have a specific idea or a suggestion, but I just, you know, now having a kid that's 16 and a kid that's 5, I guess I'm starting to see in the older one some of the ways our relationship is kind of growing into that next level that is kind of, and it doesn't happen overnight. It's like that relationship over time, and her knowing me and seeing the things that I don't do, that when I apologize or when I don't apologize, all that kind of stuff has led to the relationship we have now, and how much of a long haul thing it is. And I think of my relationship with my own mom when I was 16 and how different it is now, which is 16 was a long time ago. And, you know, I don't know, it's not I can get caught up in the I'm failing them today thing when it is a long journey. I'm talking quite dramatically, really, but you do feel like it in the moments, don't you? It's like sometimes you feel like I really messed that up. So.
Yeah, for sure. I think we've all been there, right? Or at least I'm still there pretty much every day. So you're certainly not alone on that one.
Yeah, well, I mean, the other thing on that, like, we mess stuff up, but also I think the older our kids get, the more they call us out on things too, which is kind of hard to take, but also part of it, I think, and good, and maybe goes back to Luke's earlier point and what Amy was picking up on too about power, and that this is the directions of formation are multilateral, flowing lots of ways. Yeah.
Thank you. I think one other theme that was really important to us in the book, and again emerged in ways that weren't necessarily written on the paper in words, but kind of you could sense it as you were reading, was the kind of profound connection between work for social justice, and I should say ecological justice there, because we really wanted to make sure that this book also engaged, you know, the well-being of our planet, not just of human beings on it. The connection between work for justice and spirituality. Too often, I think we split the horizontal and the vertical, right? So you believe in God, and therefore the consequence is you act for justice. They're kind of two separate things, one which flows from the other. And actually our experience, I think, certainly, you know, I'm going to speak for you here as well, Ellen, as we read through the chapters and as we processed them and as we talked together in our groups, there was a real sense that we were encountering God, that our faith was growing and changing and shifting in and through the work for justice, that the work for justice wasn't just a consequence of some static faith, but that through that grappling, through the difficult stuff, through the failures, through the juggling, somehow encounter with God could and was, and at least in the good moments was happening, and in the painful moments that God was there. So yeah, I just wondered if anybody else has experience of that kind of, that space of spirituality and social justice connecting. Luke?
Yeah, this is something I think about a lot. My faith and my spirituality has been very much enriched through a friendship I built up with a Zen Buddhist monk in a monastery down the road from where I used to live in Luton. And I can remember some years ago we were getting into a conversation about activism and justice. And he said the thing that he can't understand about us Christians is this sense of duty that we have to be doing something all the time. And I've only recently, that was a good few years ago, I only recently got around to reading the book on Zen written by the founder of the monastery, and she phrased it in a way that helped me grasp what he was getting at. So I'll read a wee bit from you, but it's talking about this principle of the idea of action by non-action. And so the kind of Zen practices that I've brought into my own spiritual life is starting the day with a sitting meditation. And I think we're quite detached from our bodies often in our Christian spirituality, whereas in Zen, when we'll talk about silence quite often, is quite in vogue among the contemplative practices, but we often miss the stillness aspect as well, and having our bodies be still, which as someone with ADHD doesn't come naturally to me. But this is what she writes about this idea of action by non-action. It means refraining from all meddling in or interfering with things, small or great. One is acting rightly because one acts with the whole of oneself just when action is called for, instead of throwing oneself like a spanner into the wheel of things blindly for the sake of doing something. A meddler has no rest and is prone to bring destruction in their wake. And I realized that I have that tendency to just throw myself like a spanner in the works when I see an injustice. But it's really been through that spiritual practice of stillness, starting my day every day in a posture of steadiness and stillness, starts to rub off on the way that I interact with people that I meet in justice work. And it starts to get easier to say no and to be present and still and to listen and to notice. So I really find that the two things of spirituality and activism, they're very symbiotic. They're not two distinct things. They're not one or other end of a spectrum, but they're very closely enmeshed with each other, certainly in my own life. And I find that, you know, my justice work and activism just ends up causing more problems than it solves when my spiritual practices are not in the right place. And, you know, being a parent, you have to figure out, I have a great spiritual director who was he was a Roman Catholic priest for about 30 years, and then he fell in love and wanted to get married, so that was the end of that. But he always says, pray as you can, not as you can't. So he really encouraged me, just develop a rule of life that works for the phase of life that you're in. You know, it's no use lamenting about what you can't do. He's like, what can you do? Can you sit down for 5 minutes after the school run and just be still, or whatever works, you know, for you. So yeah, I've found that has been the defining thing probably for me.
Thanks, Luke. Something really important there about kind of resisting the frenzy of doing for doing's sake, and discernment in a process of coming to be still and being, and allowing ourselves to be at times. So thank you. Ellen.
Yeah, it's such a great example of, I think, this thread that goes through so many chapters of really, well, I mean, this tendency that we have to think that we have these two things that are separate, that we have to stitch them back together, spirituality and social justice. And of course, the idea that they're separate is a problem. Like, that's the problem. They aren't separate. So there's no stitching back. It's just kind of remembering, oh yeah, these things are of a piece. If we can remember that and live that way, that's so important. And yeah, that was a nice illustration of that, Luke. I think there are a lot of those sort of threads throughout the chapter, or examples, really. I think one of the reasons why this theme of this interconnectedness, spirituality, and social justice are of a piece comes through so quickly is that people begin their chapters with sort of their daily lives and their practices, and then they reflect theologically on them. And when you do that, then what you're beginning with is this assumption of a kind of the radical presence of the divine in all things, right? That everything is also speaking to us about the presence of the sacred. And one of the, I'll just throw out another example of a contributor who's not here. And this is a really, it's one of my favorite. I mean, all of them are great. This is one of, for me, a particular favorite chapter. And because it's a conversation between a father and a son, Carlton and Isaiah Mackey. And Isaiah, the son, they have a family practice where Isaiah puts together these gallon Ziploc bags, and he fills them with like a water bottle, a clean pair of socks, some nutrition bars. Sometimes he'll put $1 in there. And he keeps this, he calls them these give backpacks. And he keeps them in the back seat of his dad's car. And so when they're driving around Atlanta, if there's somebody on the side of the road asking for help, then the person on the road will, approach Carlton, the dad, in the driver's seat, and Carlton will just gesture back and roll down the back seat window. And then Isaiah hands one of these gift backpacks out of the back seat. And so this chapter is the two of them sort of describing this practice, where it come from, how they why they do it. And it's just one of those, like God is in the give backpack. So there's that kind of remembrance that this action is a profoundly spiritual act. And it's rooted in, and they talk about sort of it's rooted in their family theology and lessons about tithing and giving and service, but it's also just an expression of a faith, right? An expression of faith. So, and I think that's present in several Keith Hebden's chapters about community organizing, but you sort of read that and you're aware that the community organizing work is also built on this sense of God being present in every one-on-one conversation and every relational meeting and all of the dimensions of community organizing, that there's a sense of the presence of the divine in them. And that is a sustaining kind of conviction too. So I'm sure, like you, Susie, I like start naming them and then I forget, but it is a shot through the chapters, and it's just a helpful, I think, reminder for all of us that these two things are of a piece, and they're strengthened when we remember that.
Thanks, Ellen. I mean, I wonder, did anybody pick up any different themes or anything that, you came away from the book with that was, you were like, oh, that's the thing that's really struck me from reading this. This is what I'm going to take away from it. We'd love to hear it, because of course everybody reads books and in different ways and gets from them what they need at a time. So it'd be really interesting to hear what others picked up from the book, if anybody wants to share that. Or what question you've got emerging from it, whether for yourself or for us. I always ask really big questions. It's kind of a huge question. Maybe that is the question, and something for us to kind of ponder as we go away, right? Is what is the big question that the book poses to us? And I say that to myself as well, because obviously I only wrote a little bit of it. So what's the question that kind of we're left with, which may not be one we can answer or one we should answer, but what do we sit with? And I'm going to pass back to you now, Danielle.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I feel like I have a lot to process. I could just sit in a dark room for a while now. The whole thing of I love the idea of being a learner and learning in every encounter, and the kind of how that takes the power out of things, and how much I have learned. Kind of some moments of life, it's hard to sit into the joy, but there is that great joy in knowing that I've been formed and transformed by knowing my children, and all of these, the hard times and the beautiful times, make me more of who I am, and hopefully, we're all growing together. So, anyway, thank you all so much for being part of this, and I really appreciate this conversation and the heart behind it, and it's really important. And I think I love to like pray that I'll pray that the people that watch this later, actually, that this will continue to go on and feed people, because I think there's just these moments where you just need to hear other people say, this is what I'm trying to live like, and it's hard. And I'm praying that this video will be found in someone's moment in need. And I thank you all for the book, and for sharing everything today. Thank you. I think we'll close it out there. There's more information about Red Letter Christians on our website, which you've probably found, redletterchristians.org.uk, and can follow that for what's coming up next, which I don't know what it is because I'm leaving. That sounded really final. Well, anyway, thanks everyone for everything, and I'm just going to sign off now. I'm going to stop the recording.